On the icy Monday morning of 12 December 1910, in the Arnolds townhouse at 108 East 79th Street, Manhattan, a maid remembers the sound of kid gloves being drawn on with care. Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold, 25, Bryn Mawr graduate and aspiring writer, stands in the front hall mirror, smoothing the fingers of pale gloves over chilled hands before taking up her muff and the book list she has copied out the night before. Outside, Fifth Avenue carriages grind over frozen slush. Inside, the air smells faintly of imported perfume from her father's firm. A society notice has already announced her younger sister Marjorie's forthcoming debut. Dorothy is going out to buy a dress for that ball, not for herself. When her mother offers to accompany her, she answers, as one New York paper later recalled, "When I find the gown I want, I will telephone." The gesture is small, polite, and perfectly correct. It is also, as the closed door clicks behind her, a final adjustment of the gloves of a life she is already trying to slip out of. In the humid New York summer of July 1885, the infant Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold is brought home to a world already mapped for her with the precision of an architect's drawing. The family resides at what will become their permanent address, 108 East 79th Street, in a neighborhood that represents the quiet, established wealth of New York's upper middle class. Her father, Francis R. Arnold, operates a prosperous importing business dealing in fancy goods and French perfumes, products that carry the whisper of European sophistication into American drawing rooms. Her mother, Mary Parks Arnold, comes from Montreal society, bringing with her the connections and expectations of a woman raised to understand the mechanics of social position. The family's credentials extend beyond commerce. Dorothy's aunt, Evelina Arnold Peckham, is married to Supreme Court Justice Rufus W. Peckham, a connection that appears regularly in the social register and ensures the Arnold's place within the intricate web of families who matter in New York. The social register itself, that slim blue volume published annually since 1887, functions as both directory and verdict, listing those deemed acceptable for invitation to the most exclusive gatherings. To appear in its pages is to be recognized. To be omitted is to be erased from the social map that governs marriages, partnerships, and the transmission of wealth and status across generations. The Arnolds divide their time between Manhattan and the approved resorts of the northeastern elite, summers in Newport or on the Maine coast, autumns in the Berkshires, occasional winters in milder climates. In surviving society columns from the 1890s, those brief paragraphs that document arrivals and departures at fashionable hotels, the Arnold family appears simply as names in guest lists, punctuation marks in the ongoing sentence of the season. Mr. and Mrs. Francis R. Arnold and family have taken rooms at the Ocean House, one Newport column records, the very brevity of the notice signaling that they are known quantities, requiring no explanation. The hall table at 108 East 79th Street fills throughout Dorothy's childhood with engraved calling cards and folded invitations, their thick cream paper embossed with names and addresses in elegant copperplate script. Dorothy learns early to handle them without smudging the ink. Her own small gloves, sized for a child but cut in the same style as adult versions, adjusted carefully before she's allowed into the drawing room when her mother receives visitors. The ritual is both practical and symbolic. Gloves protect the cards from finger oils that might blur the printing, but they also mark the boundary between private and public self, the moment when one steps into performance. The architecture of her childhood ordered rooms with their designated purposes, liveried servants who move through the house on prescribed routes, carriage drives that follow the same circuits through Central Park, teaches Dorothy that privilege feels solid and permanent, but is always on display, always requiring maintenance through correct behavior. The lesson is nowhere written down, but it is taught through 1,000 small corrections. Sit up straight, don't fidget, speak when spoken to, remember to thank the hostess, never draw attention to yourself except in approved ways. Even in these early society notices, Dorothy's presence is implied rather than described. Mr. and Mrs. Francis R. Arnold and daughters appears occasionally, the plural daughters compressed into a single word. their individual identities subsumed into their function as extensions of the family name. This grammatical effacement is not unusual. Children of this class appear in print primarily at birth announcements, coming out notices, and wedding announcements, the major life events that mark their progress through the expected narrative. The world into which Dorothy is born is one of enormous wealth accumulation and rigid social stratification. The 1880s and 1890s saw the consolidation of industrial and financial fortunes on a scale America has never known, creating a new aristocracy of money that seeks to establish itself through the acquisition of culture, property, and increasingly, through marriages to European nobility. The Arnolds are not at the pinnacle of this pyramid. They are not Vanderbilts or Astors, but they occupy a comfortable position within the structure, wealthy enough to maintain the expected lifestyle, connected enough to be received, respectable enough to aspire to good marriages for their daughters. Yet even in this protected environment, there are tensions. The importing business that provides the family's income is trade, which, in the most rigid interpretation of old money values, carries a faint taint of the commercial. Arnold's wealth is new enough, Francis's father established the business, that Dorothy is only one generation removed from the active pursuit of money. The family's social position depends on performing gentility convincingly enough that origins in commerce can be politely forgotten, or at least overlooked, by the time Dorothy's own name enters the social register as an adult in her early 20s. The same pages that affirm her place in society will one day help reporters reconstruct her absence. The register's annual volumes, preserved in libraries and historical societies, become archival tools for tracking who knew whom, which families connected at which addresses, what networks of obligation and acquaintance might explain where a missing woman could have gone, or why no one reported her missing for 6 weeks. The directory designed to facilitate social connection becomes, in her case, a map of the world she vanished from. By the mid-1890s, when Dorothy was approximately 10 years old, her education began in earnest at the Velton School for Girls on West 74th Street in Manhattan. The school, founded by Miss Louise Velton, represents a particular approach to female education that emerges in the late 19th century. Rigorous enough to prepare girls for the new women's colleges like Bryn Mawr, Wellesley, and Smith, but carefully framed to avoid the accusation that educated women will become unfeminine, unmarriageable, or socially radical. In classrooms with tall windows letting in the changing light of the city seasons, Dorothy sits at long wooden desks, learning French verbs through recitation, English literature through close reading, mathematics through problems worked in careful columns. The Velton School advertises a curriculum that joins science and modern languages to music and deportment, promising both intellectual development and social refinement. A surviving prospectus from the period, preserved in educational archives, describes laboratories for chemistry and physics, a library with volumes in French and German, an art studio where girls practice drawing from plaster casts, and a gymnasium where they perform calisthenics in special costumes designed to allow movement while preserving modesty. The school day is structured with precision. Morning classes focus on academic subjects: Latin grammar, ancient history, algebra, literature. Afternoons bring what are called accomplishments: piano, drawing, French conversation, dancing. The division reflects an anxiety at the heart of female education in this period: how to produce women who are intellectually capable without making them appear to threaten the social order that depends on their eventual marriages and submission to domestic life. In later reminiscences and school histories, former students describe Miss Velton as demanding but fair, expecting correct answers and proper behavior, but also genuine intellectual effort. The school's reputation rests on its success at preparing girls for the entrance examinations at the Seven Sisters colleges: Barnard, Bryn Mawr, Mount, Holyoke, Radcliffe, Smith, Vassar, and Wellesley, which by the 1890s have established themselves as serious academic institutions rather than mere finishing schools. Dorothy excels in her studies. Later reports, drawing on school records and family accounts, note that she shows particular aptitude for literature and languages, and less interest in mathematics and science. She reads widely, Not just the assigned texts, but novels and poetry from the school library, magazines that her mother brings home, anything she can find. The habit of reading becomes both pleasure and escape, a way of experiencing lives and places far beyond the circumscribed world of East 79th Street. When Dorothy entered Bryn Mawr College in the early 1900s, most likely in 1901 or 1902, when she would have been 16 or 17, she joined an institution that prides itself on academic rigor equal to men's colleges. Bryn Mawr's president, M. Carey Thomas, is a formidable advocate for women's intellectual equality, insisting on high standards and refusing to dilute the curriculum to suit conventional notions of feminine delicacy. Students study Greek and Latin, philosophy and economics, chemistry and biology. The work is demanding, the expectations high. Yet, even at Bryn Mawr, the assumption persists that most graduates will marry within their class rather than pursue professional careers. The education is real, the degrees are genuine, the learning substantial, but it exists within a larger social framework that has already determined what educated women of this class will do with their training: marry well, manage households competently, perhaps engage in charitable work or cultural pursuits, but not compete with men in the professions or challenge the fundamental structures of power. In the archives of such institutions, photographs from the period show young women in dark skirts and white shirtwaists, hair pinned up in the Gibson girl style, standing in groups on campus lawns or sitting at desks in libraries. They look serious, purposeful, and modern. They also look, to eyes trained by later history, trapped. Intelligent women being educated to return to drawing rooms, trained to think but expected not to act on their thinking in ways that would disrupt the social order. Dorothy's time at Bryn Mawr is not fully documented. Unlike some of her classmates who left diaries or whose families preserved correspondence, Dorothy appears in the college's records primarily as a name on enrollment lists. She does not graduate. She leaves before completing her degree, though exactly when and why is unclear from surviving sources. Some accounts suggest she left for health reasons. Others imply family pressure. What is certain is that by her early 20s, she had returned to 108 East 79th Street, educated but without the credential that might have given her some independence, living again under her parents' roof and authority. Etiquette manuals and educational guides from the period, preserved in university libraries and historical collections, reveal how thoroughly social training was integrated with academic education. A Bryn Mawr student would have learned glove etiquette alongside Greek declensions, proper letter writing alongside literary analysis. The effect is double-edged, a mind stretched by new ideas and rigorous study, and a body trained to sit, stand, and speak as if always watched, always being evaluated for marriageability. The education Dorothy receives promises independence and intellectual freedom, but the lessons repeatedly point back toward the parlors she came from. The world opens in books and lectures, then closes again when the prescribed path leads not to a career or independent life, but to the same townhouse, the same social calendar, the same expectation that a well-educated woman will use her training to be a better wife and mother, not to build a life of her own choosing. In later newspaper stories, after Dorothy's disappearance, reporters will marvel that a woman so well-educated could simply vanish from the very streets those lessons prepared her to walk. The education, which seemed like armor against the world's dangers, turns out to offer no protection at all against whatever happened on that December morning in 1910. The question that the reporters never quite ask is whether the education itself, by teaching Dorothy to see possibilities her world would never allow her to pursue, created a different kind of danger, the danger of knowing too much to be content with the life she was being offered. By the spring of 1910, Dorothy Arnold had been back in her parents' house for several years. Her college degree unfinished, her days structured around the same social obligations that occupied her mother's generation. The townhouse at 108 East 79th Street is built, quite literally, on perfume and fancy goods. Her father's importing business deals in French scents, cosmetics, decorative objects, the kind of luxury items that American wealth purchases to signal refinement and European sophistication. It is a prosperous business, providing the family with a comfortable income and a respectable position. But it is also, in some fundamental way, a business of surfaces, of packaging, of creating illusions of elegance and cultivation, Dorothy writes. In a bedroom that serves as improvised study, at a desk positioned to catch the morning light, she works on short stories, trying to transform the education that prepared her for drawing rooms into something more substantial, more lasting. The attempt is both conventional and quietly radical. Writing is an acceptable accomplishment for an upper-class woman. Many society women publish genteel novels or poetry, often at their own expense, but pursuing it seriously, seeking publication in competitive magazines, treating it as vocation rather than hobby, crosses an invisible line. In the spring of 1910, Dorothy submitted a short story to McClure's Magazine, one of the most prestigious and widely read periodicals of the era. McClure publishes serious fiction and investigative journalism. To appear in its pages would mark her as a genuine writer, not merely a society woman with literary pretensions. She waits for a response with the particular anxiety of someone who has invested enormous hope in a long-shot possibility. When the rejection arrives, a printed form letter, impersonal and final, family members respond with what they apparently consider kind teasing, suggesting that she focus on more appropriate pursuits, perhaps help her mother with household management or charitable work. The teasing, however gentle in intent, carries a clear message. Your ambitions are amusing, slightly ridiculous, ultimately futile. The same family that paid for years of expensive education now suggests, through laughter, that she should abandon any notion of using that education for independent achievement. The contradiction is typical of her class and time. Girls are educated to be interesting companions to educated men, not to compete with those men or to live independently of them. Dorothy responds by renting a post office box, a small act of defiance that creates a private channel for editorial correspondence, a space where rejection letters and potential acceptances need not pass through the household and become occasions for commentary. The post office box represents a claim to privacy, to a self separate from her role as Frances and Mary Arnold's daughter. It costs only a few dollars a year, but its symbolic value is much larger. It marks the boundary of a territory she is trying to claim as her own. In November 1910, she submitted a second story, The Poinsettia Flames, to an unidentified magazine. This rejection, arriving weeks before her disappearance, leaves her, according to later accounts from friends and acquaintances, embarrassed and withdrawn. The embarrassment is not merely about the rejection itself, but about having hoped, having tried, having allowed others to see her try and fail. In a world where upper-class women are expected to make everything look effortless, visible effort becomes a kind of social error, an admission that one is not naturally suited to the role one is supposed to perform. At some point during this period, the exact date is not recorded, Dorothy asks her father if she might take an apartment in Greenwich Village to write. The request is remarkable in several ways. Greenwich Village in 1910 was emerging as a bohemian neighborhood, home to artists, writers, political radicals, and people living outside conventional social norms. For an unmarried woman of Dorothy's class to live alone, particularly in such a neighborhood, would be scandalous, a breach of propriety so serious it might permanently damage her marriage prospects, and by extension her sister's as well. Frances Arnold's response is preserved in multiple later accounts. A good writer can write, anywhere. The remark is delivered, apparently, without anger or lengthy argument, simply as a statement of fact that closes the discussion. Its logic is circular and unassailable within the terms of the world he controls. If you need special circumstances to write, you're not a real writer. If you are a real writer, you don't need to leave. The position leaves no room for Dorothy to argue without admitting that she is not, in fact, talented enough to overcome the limitations of her circumstances. A surrender her father clearly expects her to make. The remark survives in the historical record because, after Dorothy's disappearance, it becomes evidence of family conflict, a small crack in the facade of harmonious family life that reporters and investigators seize upon as a possible motive. But at the time it is spoken, it is simply one more daily adjustment of expectations, One more reminder that the walls that signaled success, the inherited furnishings, the servants, the social register listing, also set the limits of what Dorothy will be permitted to attempt. She continues to write, or at least to try, at a bedroom desk, tugging at tight gloves before going downstairs to dinner, caught between the modern education that taught her to think independently and the household that treats her, writing as a phase to be outgrown rather than a calling to be supported. She exists in a space of permanent contradiction. She is too educated to be content with pure domesticity, too constrained by class and family to pursue genuine independence, too visible within her social world to disappear into bohemian anonymity, too aware of the possibilities she has read about in novels to accept that her life will be defined entirely by other people's expectations. 2 months after her father's refusal, the last book Dorothy purchases will be a slim volume titled Engaged Girl Sketches, a collection of humorous essays about courtship and engagement. Whether she buys it as a gift for someone else, or as research for her own writing, or as reading material for herself, the choice will later seem laden with irony. A woman who wanted to write about something other than marriage and courtship, buying a book that treats both as amusing inevitabilities, on the last day, anyone will reliably see her alive. In the late autumn of 1910, as New York's social season accelerates toward the winter holidays and the elaborate round of debutante balls that mark its peak, the Arnold townhouse becomes an informal academy devoted to Marjorie's preparation. At 19, Dorothy's younger sister is making her formal debut into society, the ritualized process by which an upper-class girl is presented as eligible for courtship and marriage, transformed overnight from sheltered daughter into marriageable woman. The preparation requires months of work. Society columns will eventually list Marjorie's debut among the season's important events. But before those notices appear, there are private rehearsals that turn the ordinary business of household life into something more choreographed and deliberate. Dorothy and her mother spend afternoons reviewing the elaborate etiquette of visiting cards. Who receives cards at what times, how quickly calls must be returned, what the different kinds of cards, personal formal, leaving cards, PPC cards for announcing departures, signify within the social code that governs interaction among this class. Thank you notes must be written promptly but not too promptly, with gracious language that expresses appreciation without excessive warmth, in handwriting that is legible but not showy. The notes pile up on the hall table, awaiting posting. Responses to luncheon invitations, acknowledgments of gifts, expressions of gratitude for hospitality. Each one a small performance of the social graces that make the entire system function. The seemingly trivial details, what kind of paper to use, how to fold the note, whether to have it delivered by hand or by post, carry weight because they signal whether one understands the unwritten rules, whether one belongs. Surviving etiquette manuals from the period, titles like Social Customs and The Correct Thing, preserved now in historical societies and university libraries, reveal just how elaborate and specific the rules were. A 1910 manual might devote an entire chapter to glove etiquette alone, when to remove gloves, before eating, before shaking hands with an older woman, before playing piano, when to keep them on during morning calls, at the theater, while dancing, what length of glove to wear with what style of dress, what colors are appropriate for different occasions and times of day. These are not arbitrary rules, but a complex social code that functions like a language. Those who speak it fluently signal their membership in the group. Those who make mistakes reveal themselves as outsiders, people whose claims to belonging are suspect or newly acquired. For a family like the Arnolds, wealthy but only a generation removed from the active pursuit of that wealth, respectable but not among the oldest New York families, perfect execution of social etiquette is essential. They cannot rely on ancient lineage to excuse small lapses. They must be impeccable. Dorothy, at 25, is no longer a debutante herself. She has already had her own presentation years earlier, though no detailed account of that event survives in the archives. Her role now is to support Marjorie's debut, to help manage the logistics, to serve as a kind of assistant stage manager for an elaborate performance. The work involves practical tasks like addressing invitations and tracking responses, but it also involves emotional labor, maintaining an appearance of enthusiastic participation in an event that implicitly measures her own life as less successful than her younger sisters, since Dorothy at 25 is unmarried and apparently without serious prospects. At the sideboard, in the dining room, Dorothy's fingers trace the embossed initials DHCA on her personal stationery before she signs yet another formal card, a small gesture that the maid remembers afterward because of its repetition, its almost ritual quality. The monogrammed paper is itself a marker of class, expensive, custom-ordered, the kind of detail that seems trivial until one understands that in this world, every surface that might be seen by others must reflect appropriate status. The skills required for this work are real skills, demanding in their own way. Dorothy's fluency in French is useful when writing to European acquaintances. Her quick intelligence and conversational ability, products of her Bryn Mawr education, make her a capable hostess when visitors call. Her understanding of literary and artistic topics allows her to make small talk that appears cultivated rather than merely polite. These are not empty accomplishments. They represent years of training and considerable native ability. Yet each skill is also a tile in a mosaic designed to display the family to advantage rather than to advance Dorothy's own ambitions or interests. Her education serves her family's social strategy, not her own independence. Her intelligence is deployed in managing social obligations rather than in pursuing the writing career she has attempted and been effectively discouraged from continuing. She is both instructor, teaching Marjorie, through example and direct coaching, how to navigate social situations, and participant, still subject to the same expectations even as she ages out of the role they were designed to secure. The paradox of her position is that she has been given every advantage her family could provide, yet these advantages have not translated into the autonomy or achievement she seems to want. She has been educated at a prestigious college, taught languages and literature, given access to culture and refinement, but all of this has prepared her only for a life as someone's wife, someone's hostess, someone's mother. The possibility of being simply herself, Dorothy Arnold, writer, independent woman, has never been seriously considered by anyone except Dorothy herself, and even she may doubt whether it is possible. In these tasks of preparation for Marjorie's debut, Dorothy is simultaneously inside and outside the narrative being constructed. She is essential to making the debut successful. Yet she is not the story's protagonist. She is visible in the work, but invisible in the eventual telling. The society columns will list Marjorie's debut. The invitations will bear Marjorie's name. The photographs will focus on Marjorie in her white dress. Dorothy will appear, if at all, in the background, one figure among the family members who frame the central event. While invitations go out in Marjorie's name, carefully lettered by a professional calligrapher and delivered by hand to the appropriate addresses, Dorothy will soon stage the one unscripted act of her life simply by not coming home. The same social machinery that requires such elaborate preparation for approved rituals, debuts, engagements, weddings, has no protocol for a daughter who walks out one morning and does not return. The silence that will greet her absence, the family's instinct to manage the problem privately rather than publicly, the weeks that will pass before police are officially notified. All of this follows from the same logic that governs debut preparations. Appearances must be managed, family reputation must be protected, scandal must be avoided at nearly any cost. In September 1910, 3 months before her disappearance, Dorothy Arnold leaves New York under what she presents to her parents as innocent circumstances. A visit to a Bryn Mawr friend in Boston, one of the acceptable forms of travel for an unmarried woman of her class. Such visits, properly chaperoned and carefully planned, allow young women limited mobility within a network of families who know each other and can be trusted to maintain appropriate supervision. But newspaper investigations conducted after Dorothy's disappearance will uncover a different itinerary. Instead of staying with a college friend, she spends approximately a week in a Boston hotel with George Griscom, Jr., a wealthy 42-year-old engineer from Pittsburgh with interests in international mining operations. Griscom, nearly twice Dorothy's age and from a prominent Pennsylvania family, represents the kind of match that might ordinarily be considered acceptable: good family, substantial income, appropriate connections. But he is also significantly older than Dorothy, has been married before, sources conflict on whether he is divorced or widowed, and apparently has no immediate intention of marrying again. The liaison is discovered through financial records. To pay for the trip, Dorothy pawns jewelry worth several $100s. Specific pieces mentioned in later police reports include rings and bracelets, items that would be noticed if missing, but might not be immediately missed during a supposed visit to Boston. The pawn tickets, discovered later, provide evidence that transforms what Dorothy told her parents into something quite different. Not a brief visit between friends, but a week spent living with a man in conditions that, if known, would make her unmarriageable by the standards of her class. When her parents discover the truth, how they discover it is not entirely clear from surviving sources. Though the pawn tickets were likely part of the revelation, their response is swift and absolute. They forbid further contact between Dorothy and Griscom. Their letters to him do not survive, but his later statements to police and his behavior after Dorothy's disappearance suggest that he understood he was being banished, that continuing to pursue Dorothy would mean open warfare with her family and likely social ostracism for both of them. For the Arnolds, the end stakes are not merely Dorothy's individual reputation, but the family's standing, and especially Marjorie's prospects. An older sister with a damaged reputation can make a younger sister unmarriageable, since families evaluating potential matches consider the entire family's character and behavior. One daughter having an affair with an unsuitable man, or a suitable man in unsuitable circumstances, raises questions about both parents' judgment and the moral atmosphere of the household. The Boston episode reveals with stark clarity how tightly supervised the machinery of courtship is for women of this class, even women with college educations and some independent means. Dorothy is 25 years old, legally an adult, educated at one of the country's best colleges, yet she cannot conduct a romantic relationship without her parents' approval. She cannot travel freely or live independently. She cannot even maintain a correspondence with a man they have forbidden her to see. Her mail is likely monitored, her movements tracked, her choices constrained by financial dependence and social pressure. The private rebellion, the trip to Boston, the week in the hotel, the intimacy that clearly took place, though it can only be discussed in newspaper accounts through euphemism, is brief, perhaps a few days of imagining an alternative life. Its consequences, once the deception is exposed, shape everything that follows. Her parents' response, while it appears in retrospect as harsh and controlling, would have seemed to them, and to their social world, as both necessary and appropriate. A daughter who has misbehaved must be corrected, protected from her own poor judgment, prevented from further damage to herself and her family. George Griscom Jr.'s role in Dorothy's life remains murky and contested. In later statements, he insists that he wanted to marry her and that only her parents' opposition prevented it. This claim is somewhat undermined by the fact that he made no public stand for her, took no action to challenge the family's authority, and was conveniently in Europe when she disappeared. Other accounts suggest that he had no serious intention of marrying, and that Dorothy's hope that the Boston trip would lead to engagement was a miscalculation on her part. What is documented is that after the confrontation with the Arnolds, Griscom leaves for Europe. Whether fleeing scandal or simply continuing with long-planned travel is unclear. He is abroad for several months, taking up residence in Florence, Italy, at the Anglo-American Hotel, a respectable establishment frequented by wealthy Americans making the grand tour. His distance from New York when Dorothy disappears will later make him a suspect in some theories, but also provides him with an alibi. He cannot have been directly involved in whatever happened to her, since he was thousands of miles away. The Boston trip represents Dorothy's attempt to take control of her own romantic and sexual life, to make choices based on her own desires rather than her parents' plans. The attempt fails completely. She returns to New York not liberated, but more tightly constrained, her reputation within the family damaged, her actions now subject to closer scrutiny. The space for independent action has narrowed rather than expanded. The one door that briefly opened, the possibility of a life with Griscom, whether as wife or as something less conventional, has been firmly closed. The architecture of courtship for women like Dorothy allows for supervised interactions, chaperoned visits, courtships conducted according to elaborate rules. It does not allow for the kind of autonomous decision-making that Dorothy attempted in Boston. Her gloves may be impeccably worn at home, her manners perfect, her social performance flawless, but beyond Manhattan and beyond her parents' direct supervision, her choices are treated as a breach of contract, a violation of the terms under which she has been given education and privilege. 4 months after the Boston trip, as reporters ask about runaway brides and secret marriages in the days following her disappearance, Griscom will give statements from his hotel room in Florence, denying any role in her vanishing, insisting that he has not heard from her, producing letters that he claims prove their relationship ended when her parents demanded it. Dorothy exists for him, as she will increasingly exist for everyone, only in the past tense, something that was, not something that is. The woman who wanted to be a writer, who attempted to claim some territory of her own, has instead become a character in other people's stories, her own voice permanently silenced. In the broader social world that shapes Dorothy Arnold's life, particularly in the decades between 1870 and 1914, American heiresses are crossing the Atlantic in increasing numbers to marry European aristocrats in what newspapers and historians will call the dollar princess phenomenon. The trade is simple and increasingly formalized. American women bring cash. European men bring titles. The marriages are strategic alliances that benefit both families, even when the individuals involved are indifferent or hostile to each other. Historians estimate that during this period, more than 100 British aristocrats, including 9 dukes, marry American women, with the brides bringing an estimated $220 million into impoverished aristocratic estates. The money repairs roofs at country houses, pays off accumulated debts, maintains staffs of servants, and generally allows the English upper class to continue living in the style to which they are accustomed despite agricultural depressions and the declining economic viability of inherited land. The transactions are recorded with remarkable frankness in society pages and financial documents. Marriage settlements specify exactly how much money will transfer, in what form, and under what conditions. American newspapers cover these matches extensively, treating them as business stories as much as social news, with headlines tallying the millions being exported to prop up foreign nobility. Books like Titled Americans, originally published in 1890 and updated regularly, list available aristocrats and American heiresses, functioning essentially as a matchmaking directory for families planning strategic alliances. The phenomenon produces its iconic image in John Singer Sargent's portraits of these transatlantic brides, beautiful young women in elaborate gowns, their American vitality evident even in formal poses, their new titles listed in caption plaques. The portraits hang in museums now, celebrated as art, but also readable as documents of a particular kind of transaction in which women's bodies and their families' money were exchanged for social position and hereditary titles. Dorothy Arnold's life is shaped by this context, even though she never participates in it directly. The possibility of marriage to European aristocracy, the pinnacle of achievement for wealthy American families, forms the imagined horizon of what girls like her might aspire to. Her education, her training in languages and manners, her cultivation as a beautiful and accomplished woman, all of this prepares her, theoretically, for a match that might be not merely respectable, but spectacular, transforming her from Miss Arnold of New York into Lady or even Duchess something of somewhere. Yet her own life does not follow that script. No European nobleman appears to court her. No alliance is arranged by her parents with English or continental families. She does not sail to Europe in triumph, does not appear in society pages as the latest American heiress to secure a title. Instead, we see her through fragments, school records from the Belton School and Bryn Mawr, family photographs, brief mentions in social register listings, always as someone who could theoretically have entered that grand narrative but who remains, for whatever reason, outside it. The contrast between the spectacular stories of dollar princesses and Dorothy's more obscure trajectory is itself revealing. The women who married dukes become famous, their weddings covered extensively, their lives tracked in society columns, their portraits painted by renowned artists. They enter history as individuals, even if their individuality is constrained by the roles they have been purchased to perform. Dorothy, who never achieves such a match, remains more obscure, visible primarily through her education and through the mystery of her disappearance rather than through any positive achievement or dramatic alliance. The dollar princess narrative assumes that wealth can buy position, that American money can overcome European snobbery, that the daughter of a perfume importer can become a duchess if the dowry is large enough. Dorothy's story suggests the limits of that assumption. Not every wealthy American girl makes such a match. Not every family has the connections or the willingness to spend what is required. Not every daughter is positioned correctly in the marriage market at the right moment. Some women, like Dorothy, exist in the space between what is theoretically possible and what actually happens. Trapped by expectations they can neither fulfill nor entirely escape. In the portrait gallery of Gilded Age heiresses, the actual galleries in museums, and the metaphorical gallery in histories and collective memory, Dorothy is present as a possibility rather than as a fulfilled design, as someone who might have been painted by Sargent or might have sailed to a titled marriage, but who instead remains in New York, unmarried, trying to write stories that no one will publish, conducting a secret affair that her family forbids, eventually walking out of her house one December morning and never returning. Her absence from the triumphant narrative of dollar princesses is as significant as other women's presence in it. The system that produces spectacular transatlantic matches also produces women who fall through its cracks, women who don't marry at all, who marry beneath their class, who remain financially dependent on disapproving parents, who struggle to find any role for themselves beyond the domestic and social scripts they have been trained to perform. Dorothy, educated and intelligent and ambitious, finds no place within the structures that are supposed to organize women's lives. The education prepares her for something, but that something never materializes into concrete opportunity. When she vanishes, the press will treat her less like a missing person and more like a failed narrative, an heiress who never even reached the altar, let alone secured a title or made a brilliant match. The coverage focuses on her age, 25, old for an unmarried woman of her class, her romantic entanglements, the affair with Griscom, framed as scandalous, her literary ambitions, treated as amusing but ultimately futile, and her family's attempts to manage the story. She becomes interesting not for what she achieved, but for what she failed to achieve, and for the dramatic way that failure culminated in disappearance. The dollar princess system, with its frank exchange of money for titles, its reduction of marriage to strategic alliance, its treatment of women as assets to be deployed for family advantage. This system shapes Dorothy's world even when she does not succeed within it. The alternatives to making a brilliant match are stark: unmarried dependence on one's parents, a less impressive marriage to someone merely respectable, or the kind of rebellion that Dorothy apparently attempted briefly in Boston, and perhaps finally on December 12th, when she walked out of her parents' house and did not come back. By late November 1910, preparations for Marjorie Arnold's debut intensified to a point where they structured the entire household's rhythm. The debut itself, planned for early 1911, will be one of the significant social events of the season. Not as grand as the balls thrown by Vanderbilts or Astors, but respectable, appropriate, the kind of event that signals a family's secure place within New York society and a daughter's successful entry into the marriage market. Contemporary accounts of debutante preparations describe a process that extends over months. Dancing masters are hired to ensure that girls are fluent in the waltz, the cotillion, and other dances they will be expected to perform. Language tutors polish conversational French and perhaps German, since European travel is an expected part of a cultured woman's life. Dressmakers are consulted repeatedly as the debut gown evolves through fittings and adjustments. Guest lists are compiled, debated, revised. Who must be invited? Who may be invited? Who should be excluded? All calibrated to send the right signals about the family's connections and status. The debut itself will involve specific rituals. The receiving line where Marjorie and her parents will greet hundreds of guests. The formal presentation. At some debuts, the debutante literally curtsies to an older woman representing society's approval. The first dance, traditionally with her father. The supper for selected guests. Every element is choreographed. Nothing is left to chance or improvisation. The entire event is designed to display Marjorie as a finished product, beautiful, accomplished, properly trained, ready to be courted and married. Dorothy, at 25, moves through these preparations as a supporting figure, her own debut years behind her, and apparently without result. Society pages from the period indicate that she had her own formal introduction to society several years earlier. The exact date is not preserved in easily accessible sources, but standard practice would have been a debut at 18 or 19, around 1903 or 1904. That event, unlike Marjorie's, produced no engagement, no marriage, no successful outcome by the measures that matter to families arranging such occasions. In photographs of similar Upper East Side interiors from this period, preserved in museum collections and historical archives, we can see what these preparations looked like. Drawing rooms with furniture pushed back to create space for dancing, girls in white dresses practicing waltz steps with male partners, often hired to serve as stand-ins during rehearsals, chaperones observing from chairs along the walls. The entire scene suffused with afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. It is not difficult to transpose Dorothy into such frames, to imagine her standing beside Marjorie, demonstrating the correct posture, the appropriate smile, the graceful movement that looks effortless but requires hours of practice. The archival trail records no complaint from Dorothy about this work, no letter or diary entry expressing resentment at playing a supporting role in her younger sister's triumph. The absence of such evidence does not necessarily mean absence of such feeling. Women of this class were trained from childhood to suppress expressions of discontent, to maintain gracious facades, to support family strategies, even at personal cost. But it does mean that any unhappiness Dorothy felt remains inaccessible to us, locked in the interior life that she was taught never to expose publicly. What is documented is her continued attendance at teas and luncheons, her name occasionally attached to committee work for charitable organizations, her presence at events that fill the social calendar between Thanksgiving and the New Year. In society columns, she appears as Miss Arnold or the Mrs. Arnold. When both sisters attend the same event, her individuality subsumed into her role as Arnold daughter, her own identity less important than her function within family performance. Yet the repeated small gestures, the smoothing of gloves before descending the staircase, the adjustment of hat and veil before leaving the house, the careful penmanship on thank-you notes and calling cards, acquire new meaning in retrospect. These are not merely habits, but rituals of self-preparation, moments of transition between private and public self. The gloves in particular function as a kind of armor, marking the boundary between the person Dorothy might be alone in her room and the person she must perform when observed. As society busies itself with the details of Marjorie's entrance, the flowers to be ordered, the musicians to be hired, the caterer to be consulted, the guest list to be finalized, Dorothy's most decisive act will occur far from any ballroom, in the mundane circumstances of an ordinary shopping day. The contrast is almost certainly deliberate on her part. While everyone's attention is focused on Marjorie's elaborately planned and scripted entrance into society, Dorothy will make her unscripted exit, walking down Fifth Avenue in broad daylight, not fleeing in darkness or leaving a note, simply not coming back. The timing suggests that Dorothy's disappearance is not impulsive or irrational, but carefully chosen. She waits until preparations for Marjorie's debut are well advanced but not yet complete, until the household is busy and distracted, until her absence might be noticed quickly but not immediately, until the family's attention is focused elsewhere. The choice to disappear on an ordinary shopping trip rather than during a more dramatic moment, a ball, a confrontation with her parents, A romantic crisis is itself revealing. She takes the familiar path, follows the routine, performs the expected role, right up until the moment she stops performing it. On December 12th, when Dorothy walks down Fifth Avenue carrying her muff and her book list, wearing the blue serge coat and black velvet hat that will be described in police circulars, she moves through a landscape utterly familiar to her. These streets where she has walked hundreds of times, these shops where she is known by name, these routines of upper-class life that structure every day. The last confirmed conversation with Gladys King outside Brentano's bookstore is about the very event, Marjorie's debut, that frames the entire season. "I'm saving you a stamp," King jokes as she hands Dorothy the acceptance card, and they speak briefly about the party before King hurries off to meet her mother for lunch at the Waldorf Astoria. It is the last confirmed sighting. In that small, courteous exchange, two young women trading social obligations on a busy sidewalk, surrounded by other pedestrians, carriages, the ordinary business of a Monday morning in Manhattan. We see the machinery of a world that assumes every path is predictable. Every proper young woman will go where she is expected to go. The same social rules that govern their brief conversation, the etiquette that required Dorothy to accept the card and to make pleasant small talk, will help delay for 6 weeks the one response that might have made a difference, immediately notifying the police that a woman is missing. In the weeks immediately before December 1910, after McClure's magazine rejects The Poinsettia Flames, Dorothy's second attempt at publication, friends and family members later recall her as unusually quiet, withdrawn into herself in ways that even her habitual reserve does not quite explain. The rejection arrives as a printed form letter, the standard response to unsolicited manuscripts, offering no commentary or encouragement, simply the news that her work has been deemed unsuitable for publication. The sting of the rejection is compounded by her family's response. In later newspaper accounts and in statements given to investigators after her disappearance, acquaintances describe how her parents and extended family treated her literary ambitions with what they apparently considered affectionate amusement, gentle teasing about her writing phase, suggestions that she would outgrow these fancies, perhaps gentle pressure to focus on more appropriate activities like supporting Marjorie's debut or engaging in charitable work that would look respectable on a marriage resume. The teasing, though not intended as cruel, carries an unmistakable message about the family's assessment of Dorothy's talent and prospects as a writer. They do not take her seriously. Her education at Bryn Mawr, her intelligence and literary sensitivity, her genuine dedication to the craft, none of this is sufficient to overcome their assumption that writing is a hobby rather than a vocation, an accomplishment like piano playing or watercolor painting rather than a serious professional pursuit. One particularly tantalizing piece of evidence appears in a 1911 Evening World article, cited in later scholarship and archived in historical newspaper databases. The article suggests that Dorothy had briefly vanished from home once before, around Thanksgiving 1910, returning after a day or two. Without explanation, if this account is accurate, and its reliability is impossible to verify definitively since it comes from a sensationalist newspaper eager to build a compelling narrative, it would give her eventual disappearance a haunting prelude, a dress rehearsal for the final exit. The Thanksgiving incident, if it occurred, was apparently resolved privately within the family. No police report was filed, no public search was conducted, no scandal ensued. Dorothy returned, or was returned, and life continued. But the episode, real or imagined by the newspaper, suggests a pattern. A young woman testing the boundaries of what is possible, trying to claim some autonomy, finding those boundaries more rigid than she hoped, and retreating, at least temporarily, to the prescribed role. There is no diary in Dorothy's own hand to help interpret these movements, no letters preserved in which she confides her emotional state to a friend, no direct testimony from her about what she was thinking or feeling in these final weeks. The archive offers only the bare chronology of documented facts. Postal records showing when magazines returned her submissions, magazine correspondence files confirming the rejections, later police summaries reconstructing her movements based on witness testimony. We see her from the outside, through other people's observations and memories, never from within. On cold December afternoons in the weeks before her disappearance, neighbors and acquaintances later remember seeing Dorothy walking alone near Central Park, her gloved hands tucked into a fur muff for warmth, her posture as correct as any debutante's, but walking without a chaperone or companion. For a woman of her age and class, such solitary walks occupy an ambiguous social space. They are not quite improper. A 25-year-old woman has more freedom than a teenager, but they are not quite respectable either, since proper ladies are expected to move through public spaces with companions, to be always situated within networks of family and social connection, rather than walking alone through the city. These walks suggest Dorothy claiming small territories of independence, moments when she is not performing any particular social role, not daughter or sister or prospective bride, simply a woman walking through the winter city, thinking her own thoughts, existing briefly outside the structures that otherwise define every moment of her day. The muff, the gloves, the well-tailored coat all mark her as a woman of means and status, but the solitude marks her as something else, something not quite contained by the roles available to women of her position. The distance between home and the world, between the townhouse at 108 East 79th Street and the city that extends beyond it in every direction, narrows in these walks to the width of a sidewalk, a space Dorothy can cross in a single step. The boundary that seems so absolute when enforced by parents and social expectations becomes, in the physical act of walking, permeable, negotiable, something she can push against even if she cannot yet cross permanently. On December 12th, those familiar steps, from home to the post office to check for editorial responses, to shops along Fifth Avenue, perhaps through Central Park, as she told Gladys King she planned, will be repeated once more, with only slight variations in the exact route and timing, and then stop entirely. The routine that has structured her days for years, the predictable circuit of acceptable destinations and approved activities, will be interrupted not by anything dramatic or visible to outside observers, but simply by the fact that she does not return home. The performance that has required such discipline and produced such perfect results, Dorothy Arnold, well-bred young woman of good family, educated, accomplished, marriageable, if no longer in the first bloom of youth, will end not with any grand gesture, but with a quiet withdrawal from the stage, leaving behind only the question of whether the exit was voluntary or forced, chosen or imposed. On the late morning of Monday, December 12, 1910, Dorothy Arnold leaves the townhouse at 108 East 79th Street, carrying approximately $25 to $30 in cash, dressed for the cold in a blue serge coat with a shorter jacket over it, a black velvet hat with blue velvet flowers, and black high-heeled boots. The outfit is described in detail in later police circulars and newspaper accounts because these are the clothes she was wearing when last seen. The visual details that might help someone recognize her. The costume of her final performance as Dorothy Arnold of New York. She is going shopping, a perfectly ordinary activity for a young woman of her class, the kind of errand that requires no special permission or explanation. The stated purpose is to buy an evening dress for Marjorie's debut, a task that positions Dorothy as supporting player in her sister's story, an appropriate and expected use of her time. She carries a list of books she wants to purchase or examine, copied out the night before in her careful handwriting, suggesting that this is a planned expedition rather than an impulsive flight. At Park and Tilford, a high-end grocer at Fifth Avenue and 59th Street, she charges a half-pound box of chocolates to the family account, tucking the small parcel into her muff. The transaction is recorded in the store's ledger, one of the few absolutely certain facts about her final morning, documented in business records that survive her disappearance. The chocolates will later be found in her muff when it is recovered, or will be mentioned in some accounts but not others. The sources conflict on this detail, one of many small ambiguities in a story that is all ambiguity, all gaps where certainty should be. From Park and Tilford, she walks south on Fifth Avenue to Brentano's bookstore, a substantial establishment that served as both bookshop and gathering place for New York's literary culture. Here, she purchases a slim volume titled Engaged Girl Sketches by Emily Calvin Blake, a collection of humorous essays about courtship and the engagement period. The book costs 75 cents. Again, documented in Brentano's sales records, one of the fixed points in an otherwise uncertain narrative. The choice of book will later seem to investigators and reporters freighted with significance. Why would an unmarried woman with no announced engagement buy a book about being engaged? Is it research for her own writing? Perhaps she's planning a story about courtship. Is it a gift for someone else? Maybe for Marjorie, who is entering the marriage market? Is it reading material for herself, a kind of vicarious participation in a life stage she has not reached, and perhaps fears she never will? Or is it, as some more sensational accounts will suggest, evidence that she was secretly engaged or planning to elope, making preparations for a future she intended to claim by disappearing? Outside Brentano's, at approximately 2 p.m., Dorothy encounters Gladys King, a young woman of similar age and social position, someone who moves in the same circles and understands the unspoken rules that govern their world. King is walking with her mother on their way to lunch at the Waldorf Astoria. In the brief conversation that follows, reconstructed later from King's testimony to police and reporters, King hands Dorothy an acceptance card for Marjorie's debut, joking that she is saving her a stamp, and they exchange pleasantries about the forthcoming ball. Gladys King will later recall, with the terrible precision that comes from knowing this was the last time, that Dorothy seemed cheerful, normal, showing no signs of distress or unusual emotion. She said she had bought some things, presumably referencing the chocolates and book, and mentioned that she planned to walk home through Central Park rather than taking a carriage, a route of approximately 20 blocks that would take perhaps 30 or 40 minutes at a leisurely pace, longer if she stopped to sit or to look at the winter landscape. When King hurries off to meet her mother's schedule, they have a reservation at the Waldorf and cannot be late. Dorothy adjusts her gloves, tucks her packages more securely into her muff, and turns south rather than north, walking away from the direction of home, away from Central Park, deeper into the city. This detail, that she was last seen walking south, away from home, will become significant later, though its significance is unclear. Is she simply planning to make another stop before heading home? Has she changed her mind about the route? Or is this the moment when the ordinary shopping trip transforms into something else? When Dorothy steps off the prescribed path and into the unknown? It is the last confirmed sighting. After this moment, Dorothy Arnold vanishes into the crowd on Fifth Avenue on a Monday afternoon in December, one figure among hundreds of pedestrians, nothing unusual or remarkable about her appearance or behavior, nothing that would make witnesses remember her specifically or be able to reconstruct her movements with certainty. In that small, courteous exchange with Gladys King, two young women trading social obligations on a busy sidewalk, performing the rituals of their class with perfect ease, we see for the last time the machinery of a world that assumes every path is predictable. Every proper young woman will eventually arrive at her expected destination. By that evening, when Dorothy does not return for dinner at the expected hour, the same social rules that governed her conversation with King will help shape the family's response, delaying the one action that might have made a difference, immediately notifying the New York City Police Department that a woman is missing. Instead, the Arnolds will spend 6 weeks trying to manage the crisis privately, to preserve reputation, to avoid scandal, to find their daughter without exposing the family to public scrutiny and speculation. When Dorothy does not return for dinner on the evening of December 12th, her family grows concerned but remains within the bounds of what they consider appropriate discretion. For nearly 6 weeks, specifically until January 25, 1911, they do not notify the New York City Police Department, instead pursuing private channels to locate her, telephoning friends and acquaintances to ask if she has visited them, checking with relatives to see if she has appeared unexpectedly at their homes, consulting with hired private investigators who are paid to conduct searches without publicity. The family's initial contacts are with John S. Keith, a private detective with offices in Manhattan, and with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the most famous and respected private investigation firm in the country. These agencies begin searching immediately, checking hospitals and morgues, visiting boarding houses and hotels, interviewing people who might have seen Dorothy, or who might know something about her plans or state of mind. The searches are thorough but handicapped by the need for secrecy. The detectives cannot widely publicize Dorothy's disappearance or circulate her photograph without attracting exactly the kind of attention the family is desperate to avoid. The motive for this silence, as later reconstructed from press conferences, family statements, and correspondence preserved in various archives, is reputation. A missing daughter is a scandal, and scandal in this world is contagious, spreading from the immediate victim to contaminate the entire family. If Dorothy has run away, the most likely explanation in many people's minds, then publicity will only make things worse, broadcasting the family's private crisis and making Dorothy herself more notorious. If she has been the victim of foul play, publicity still carries risks. It might spur the perpetrators to kill her if she is being held alive, or it might simply expose the family to cruel speculation and gossip at a moment when they are already suffering. Most pressingly, widespread publicity about Dorothy's disappearance could damage Marjorie's marriage prospects. A younger sister with an older sister who has vanished in mysterious circumstances, whose name has been in newspapers in connection with scandal or potential crime, becomes less marriageable. Families evaluating Marjorie as a potential daughter-in-law would have to weigh not just her own character and qualities, but the whole question of what happened to Dorothy, whether there is something wrong with the Arnold family, whether association with them carries risks. In the townhouse at 108 East 79th Street, the evidence of Dorothy's absence accumulates in ways both obvious and subtle. Her bedroom remains as she left it that morning. Bed made by the maid before she went out, clothes hanging in orderly rows in the wardrobe, her writing desk with its papers and pens and the manuscript of The Poinsettia Flames that was rejected by the unnamed magazine. On the hall stand, gloves and hats wait for an owner who does not return to claim them. The monogrammed stationery with her initials, the calling cards with her name. All the material apparatus of her social identity remains, outlasting her presence, waiting for a hand that will never again take them up. Outside the house, life continues. The social season proceeds toward Christmas and the New Year, with dinners and theater parties and the endless round of obligations that structure the weeks between Thanksgiving and Lent. Preparations for Marjorie's debut continue. They must continue because to cancel or postpone would require explanation, would raise questions, and would itself become a kind of scandal. The Arnolds attend events, maintain appearances, perform normalcy while privately conducting an increasingly desperate search. John S. Keith's reports to the family, later summarized in newspaper accounts based on interviews with him after the case became public, record a systematic but fruitless search. He checks Bellevue Hospital and other city hospitals to see if an unidentified woman matching Dorothy's description has been admitted. He visits the city morgue to examine bodies of unidentified women recovered from the rivers or found dead in the streets. He contacts police in other cities, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, to see if a woman matching Dorothy's description has come to official attention there. He interviews Dorothy's friends and acquaintances, trying to learn if she confided plans to anyone, if she seemed distressed or made unusual remarks in the days before her disappearance. The Pinkertons pursue similar leads on a broader scale, using their national network of agents and offices to search beyond New York. They send Dorothy's description to agencies across the country, check passenger lists on trains and steamships leaving New York, follow up on rumors and unconfirmed sightings that lead nowhere. The work is professional and thorough, but it is also, by necessity, constrained. They cannot advertise widely or offer rewards or do the things that might generate the kind of public attention that could actually help locate a missing person. The family's choice to pursue private investigation rather than public police involvement is strategic and, within their own frame of reference, rational. They are protecting reputation, managing information, trying to control a situation that feels dangerous precisely because it is so completely beyond their control. The same instincts that govern every other aspect of upper-class life, the preference for handling problems privately, The horror of public scandal, the belief that money can solve most difficulties, shape their response to Dorothy's disappearance. Yet each day of silence hardens into something else. Time lost, trails going cold, memories fading, evidence degrading or disappearing, witnesses forgetting or moving away, the statistical probability of finding Dorothy alive declining with every hour that passes. The window for effective action, which is already narrow in any missing person case, closes day by day while the Arnolds try to solve the problem without exposing themselves to the very publicity that might actually help. When Francis R. Arnold finally steps before reporters in late January 1911, sitting at his desk with his hands folded and his expression carefully controlled, the mystery has already acquired 6 weeks of unanswered questions, countless false leads, and a complexity that will make it nearly impossible to solve. The decision to wait, to handle the crisis privately, to protect reputation above all else, has guaranteed that whatever happened to Dorothy on December 12th will remain forever obscure, forever subject to speculation and theory, but never to certainty or proof. On January 25, 1911, 6 weeks and 2 days after Dorothy Arnold's disappearance, reporters crowd into Francis R. Arnold's office in Lower Manhattan as he made the case public for the first time. The announcement is carefully staged. Arnold sits at his desk, speaking in measured tones, distributing a prepared statement and a photograph of Dorothy that will be reproduced in newspapers across the country. He offers a reward of $1,000 for information leading to Dorothy's location, a substantial sum, but not extravagant, calibrated to encourage response without suggesting desperation or unlimited resources. The photograph that accompanies the announcement shows Dorothy in formal dress, dark-haired and serious, looking directly at the camera with an expression that later interpreters will variously describe as melancholy, intelligent, defiant, or simply composed. It is the image that will come to define her in public memory, reproduced in newspapers and eventually in books and articles and digital databases. The face of a mystery that will never be solved. Police circulars go out immediately, distributed through the New York City Police Department and sent to police departments across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The circulars include Dorothy's photograph and physical description. 25 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighing approximately 130 pounds, with dark hair, brown eyes, clear complexion. The clothing she was wearing is described in detail: the blue serge coat, the black velvet hat with blue flowers, the high-heeled boots. The circulars list the items she was carrying: the muff, the chocolates, the book, approximately $25 to $30 in cash. The New York Times and other major newspapers cover the story extensively, often placing it on the front page or in prominent positions inside. The coverage mixes facts with speculation, genuine reporting with sensationalism, respect for the family with barely concealed skepticism about their account of events. Headlines vary in tone from sympathetic, mysterious disappearance of society girl to more suggestive, Dorothy Arnold missing, did she elope? To openly skeptical questioning of why the family waited so long to report her missing. Letters and telegrams flood into the Arnold residence and into police headquarters, as they always do in high-profile missing person cases. Some are genuine attempts to help, people who think they may have seen Dorothy, or who have information about similar disappearances, or who simply want to express sympathy. Others are from cranks and attention seekers, people claiming to have kidnapped Dorothy, people claiming to be Dorothy herself, people offering psychic services or proposing elaborate theories. Each lead, no matter how implausible, must be investigated and eliminated, consuming time and resources without advancing the search. 2 ransom notes arrived demanding thousands of dollars for Dorothy's safe return. Police and family investigators quickly determined both are hoaxes, written by people trying to exploit the family's distress for financial gain. A postcard arrives postmarked from New York, reading simply, "I am safe," and signed Dorothy. Francis Arnold examines the handwriting and declares it an imitation, not his daughter's genuine script. The postcard is preserved as evidence but leads nowhere. It is impossible to determine who sent it or why, whether as a cruel prank or a misguided attempt at comfort or something else entirely. Meanwhile, in Florence, Italy, detectives working on behalf of the Arnold family locate George Griscom Jr. at the Anglo-American Hotel and question him about his relationship with Dorothy and whether he has heard from her since her disappearance. Griscom, according to later newspaper accounts based on police reports, appears surprised by the news of Dorothy's disappearance and denies any involvement or knowledge. He produces letters from Dorothy written before her disappearance, letters that apparently discuss their relationship and her unhappiness with her family's interference, but contain no suggestion of plans to disappear or to elope. Dorothy's brother John travels to Florence to confront Griscom directly and to retrieve the letters. What happens during this confrontation is not fully documented. John Arnold gives no detailed account to reporters, and Griscom's own statements are brief and defensive. What is documented is that John obtains the letters and, upon returning to New York, burns them. The destruction of this correspondence, which might have provided crucial insight into Dorothy's state of mind and plans in the weeks before her disappearance, is one of the great frustrations for later investigators and historians trying to understand what happened. Theories multiply, each one generating its own newspaper coverage and public debate. The elopement theory suggests that Dorothy arranged to meet Griscom or another man, that they married secretly, or simply fled together to start a new life somewhere beyond her family's reach. The suicide theory points to her literary failures and romantic disappointments as evidence of depression, suggesting she might have jumped from a bridge or otherwise ended her own life. The murder theory proposes that she was attacked by a stranger in Central Park or lured to a meeting with someone who killed her. The voluntary disappearance theory imagines Dorothy starting a new life under a different name, perhaps in a distant city or even abroad, finally claiming the independence she could not achieve as Dorothy Arnold of New York. Francis Arnold tells journalists his own theory. He has always believed, he says, that Dorothy was attacked in Central Park by robbers or other criminals, that she was killed and her body thrown into the Central Park reservoir to hide the evidence. Police quietly doubt this theory. The reservoir was frozen solid on December 12th, and it would have been nearly impossible to break through the ice without attracting attention or leaving obvious evidence. But Arnold clings to this explanation, perhaps because it allows him to imagine Dorothy as a victim, rather than as someone who chose to leave, perhaps because it preserves her reputation by explaining her disappearance as crime rather than choice. In these competing narratives, Dorothy's own voice is entirely absent, replaced by men. Her father, the detectives, the reporters, Griscom, arguing over what kind of story her life must have been. She appears only as object, never as subject. The missing woman, the victim, the runaway, the suicide, the foolish girl, the tragic figure, the education that was supposed to give her voice, the writing that was supposed to let her tell stories, all of it has been silenced or overwritten by the much louder voices of men who claim authority to interpret her life and disappearance. Even as official searches wind down in the weeks and months following the initial announcement, police concluding there is no evidence of foul play and no leads to pursue, private detectives reaching the limits of what can be discovered without Dorothy's cooperation. Scattered clues will continue to surface for years, keeping her image alive in newspapers and public memory. A veiled woman at a hotel in Florence, who might be Dorothy. An engraved ring discovered in a San Francisco pawn shop that resembles one she owned. Reported sightings from dozens of cities that all lead nowhere. Each new possibility generating brief, renewed interest before fading back into the archive of unsolved mysteries. In the years immediately following 1911, and periodically for more than a decade afterward, Dorothy Arnold's name resurfaces whenever a new theory promises resolution or when someone confesses to knowledge of what happened to her. Each new development generates headlines, attracts investigators, raises and then dashes the family's hopes, and ultimately adds another layer to the archive of speculation without bringing any certainty. In 1914, 3 years after Dorothy's disappearance, a New York investigation into an illegal abortion clinic led to claims that she died during a botched procedure and that her body was disposed of by burning in a furnace to hide the evidence. The claim comes from someone connected to the clinic who may be trying to bargain for leniency by offering information about a famous case. The story is lurid and detailed enough that District Attorney Edward Swan calls it plausible and worth investigating. Detectives search the former site of the clinic, interview people who might have been involved, try to trace records that might confirm or refute the claim. Francis Arnold, in a statement to reporters, dismisses the theory as ridiculous, though on what evidence he bases this certainty is unclear. His dismissal might reflect genuine knowledge that Dorothy could not have been pregnant, though how he could know this with certainty is questionable, or it might simply be a father's refusal to accept such a scenario. The investigation eventually peters out without producing physical evidence or definitive proof, leaving the abortion theory as one more possibility among many. Unproven, but also not definitively disproven. In 1916, an imprisoned extortionist named Edward Glenorris makes a sensational claim. He says he was paid to bury Dorothy Arnold's body in a cellar in New Rochelle, New York, after she died during a botched abortion performed in Weehawken, New Jersey. The story is specific in its details. Glenorris names addresses, describes the layout of rooms, provides a narrative that sounds convincing in its specificity. Police take the claim seriously enough to excavate basements and cellars at the locations he identifies, digging through dirt and examining drainage systems, searching for human remains or any evidence that supports Glenorris's story. They find nothing: no bones, no clothing, no physical evidence of any kind. Glenorris, it becomes clear, is either lying for unknown reasons or is genuinely confused, perhaps remembering some other crime or simply fabricating a story that he hopes will gain him attention or some advantage in his legal situation. The excavations are filled in, the investigation closes, and Glenorris fades back into obscurity, leaving behind only more newspaper clippings in the growing archive of false leads and unverified confessions. Private Detective John S. Keith, who worked for the Arnold family in the initial weeks after Dorothy's disappearance, later tells reporters that he came to believe she died by suicide, despondent over her stalled writing career, her impossible romance with Griscom, the sense that her life had reached a dead end with no acceptable way forward. Keith's theory is based not on physical evidence, but on his psychological assessment of Dorothy's situation. An educated woman trapped in circumstances that offered her no outlet for her ambitions, romantic hopes crushed by family opposition, facing the prospect of remaining indefinitely in her parents' home as an increasingly marginal figure in family life. Other investigators and commentators insist she must have started a new life under another name, perhaps moving to the West or to a foreign country, perhaps taking advantage of the relative anonymity available to a woman willing to shed her past and claim a new identity. This theory imagines Dorothy as having agency, making a choice, successfully executing a planned escape from a life she found intolerable. It is, in some ways, the most optimistic theory. It allows for the possibility that she is alive somewhere, living on her own terms, free of family control. None of these accounts are proved, despite years of investigation, thousands of dollars spent on detectives and searches, extensive newspaper coverage that keeps the case in public consciousness. No physical evidence of Dorothy's fate ever emerges. No body is ever recovered. No confirmed sighting after December 12, 1910 is ever established. No definitive proof of any of the competing theories is ever found. What is documented with certainty is the slow adjustment of those left behind. Francis R. Arnold, Dorothy's father, dies in 1922, having spent the final 11 years of his life never knowing what happened to his eldest daughter. His will, written in the years after Dorothy's disappearance and preserved in probate records, explicitly omits her. She is not mentioned at all, as if legally she no longer exists. The omission is both practical. Without a death certificate or declaration of death, her legal status is ambiguous, and deeply sad. A father formally severing connection to a daughter who vanished and never returned. Mary Parks Arnold, Dorothy's mother, lived until 1928, 17 years beyond the last time she saw her daughter. In occasional interviews with reporters who check on the case's anniversaries or when new theories emerge, she expresses continued hope that Dorothy is alive somewhere, that someday she will return or make contact. The hope seems to sustain her, but also to prevent her from fully grieving or accepting Dorothy's absence as permanent. She maintains Dorothy's room as it was, keeps her clothes and possessions, and waits for a resolution that will never come. The family's private suffering plays out against the background of enormous social change. The rigid New York 400 that dominated society when Dorothy was growing up lost their cultural authority in the decades following World War I. The war itself, the introduction of income taxes, the gradual democratization of American life, the changing roles of women, all of these forces erode the world that shaped Dorothy's life and that seemed so permanent when she was a girl. The more conjectures accumulate in newspapers and police files, the clearer it becomes that the most honest sentence may be the simplest and least satisfying. Dorothy Arnold walked out of her family's house on the morning of December 12, 1910, and was never seen again. Everything beyond that fact is speculation, theory, hope, fear, imagination. The truth, whatever it is, went with her into whatever happened on that winter day in Manhattan, and it has never been recovered. Long after the excavations in New Rochelle cellars are filled, long after the illegal clinic's doors are closed and its operators dead or imprisoned for other crimes, long after Francis and Mary Arnold are buried without ever knowing their daughter's fate, the strongest traces of Dorothy's existence will not be bodies or confessions or physical evidence of any kind. They will be paper, school registers listing her as a student, social register volumes recording her family's address, college records from Bryn Mawr, magazine rejection letters in McClure's correspondence files, police circulars with her photograph and description, newspaper articles by the hundreds, and somewhere in an official file, a missing person report that was never closed because the person was never found. In the decades that follow Dorothy Arnold's disappearance, the world that shaped her life continues to erode and transform, making the rigid social structures of 1910 feel increasingly remote, nearly incomprehensible to later generations. The First World War, beginning in 1914, marks a decisive break. The old certainties and hierarchies that seemed permanent prove fragile, and the aftermath brings new attitudes toward women, work, marriage, and individual freedom. Her younger sister Marjorie, for whom Dorothy was helping prepare the debut that would never happen, makes her formal entrance into society on schedule in 1911, proceeding as if the family is not privately shattered by Dorothy's absence. The debut is reported in society columns with no mention of the missing sister, the silence itself a kind of performance, a demonstration of the family's determination to maintain appearances even in the face of a profound private crisis. Marjorie marries, as was intended, a young man from an acceptable family. She marries at 20 in 1912, 2 years after Dorothy's disappearance, a respectable match that fulfills the purpose for which her debut was designed. The marriage, like many society marriages, does not last. She divorces some years later, a choice that would have been scandalous in her mother's generation, but becomes increasingly common in the 1920s and 1930s as divorce loses some of its stigma. Eventually, according to one descendant who spoke to National Geographic in a 2007 article about the case, Marjorie moves abroad and stops using the Arnold name entirely, perhaps to escape the shadow of her sister's disappearance, perhaps to build a life not defined by family scandal. The decision to abandon the family name, a name that meant something in 1910 New York, that appeared in the social register, that signified belonging, suggests how completely Dorothy's disappearance altered the trajectory of the family, how the mystery became a weight that even those not directly involved needed to escape. Historians of women's education cite institutions like Bryn Mawr College and preparatory schools like the Velton School as pioneers in providing rigorous training for women, opening possibilities that previous generations did not have. These institutions were genuinely progressive for their time, believing that women were capable of serious intellectual work and deserving of the same quality of education as men. The graduates of these schools in the late 19th and early 20th centuries included women who became scholars, writers, social reformers, professionals in fields newly opening to women. Yet Dorothy's story highlights the limits of that education when it existed within a larger social framework that had not changed to accommodate educated women's ambitions. Her Bryn Mawr education taught her to think, to analyze, to write, to imagine possibilities beyond domestic life. But her family and her social world still expected her to marry well, to manage a household, to fulfill traditional female roles. The education created desires and capacities that the social structure could not or would not allow her to exercise. The contradiction between what education promised and what society permitted may have been literally unbearable. Crime writers and academic students of missing persons cases return repeatedly to Dorothy Arnold's disappearance as a defining early example of a media-saturated mystery, one that did much to develop modern newspaper police coverage, as a 1920s obituary for Mary Arnold observed. The case established patterns that would become standard in later decades. The missing woman as object of fascination and speculation, the family's statement to the press, the reward posters, the false leads and confessions, the competing theories that say as much about public anxieties as about the actual case. The coverage of Dorothy's disappearance reveals the assumptions of 1910 America about women, class, sexuality, and propriety. The press treats her disappearance as inherently more interesting than the disappearances of poor women or immigrant women who also went missing in New York during the same period, but received no comparable attention. Her class position makes her disappearance newsworthy. It also shapes how that disappearance is interpreted, with much speculation about elopement, unsuitable romances, and family control. Today, Dorothy's image appears in digital archives and true crime essays, in blog posts and amateur detective forums, in academic articles about gender and class in the Gilded Age, in exhibitions about unsolved mysteries. The photograph from 1911, the formal portrait, the serious expression, the Edwardian dress, has been scanned and digitized, appears in thumbnail and full resolution, is endlessly reproducible, and available to anyone with an internet connection. She has become, in some sense, more visible in death or disappearance than she ever was in life. As Dorothy Arnold of New York, she was simply one among thousands of women of her class, notable primarily within the small world of the social register families. Her existence documented in scattered mentions in society columns and school records. As the missing woman, the unsolved mystery, she becomes a figure of public fascination. Her story told and retold, her photograph examined by strangers, her life and choices endlessly debated by people who know her only through the archive of newspaper clippings and official records. In a museum exhibition on the Gilded Age, and such exhibitions exist in various forms in institutions across the United States, her story might be represented through a careful arrangement of objects, a pair of period kid gloves, carefully preserved in archival tissue, a first edition of Engaged Girl Sketches by Emily Calvin Blake, perhaps open to a particular page, a reproduction of the police circular with her photograph, a copy of the Social Register from 1910, open to the page listing the Arnold family at 108 East 79th Street. The objects are ordinary, the kind of things that tens of thousands of women of her class owned and used. Kid gloves were standard accessories, replaced regularly as they wore out or went out of fashion. Books like Engaged Girl Sketches sold in the thousands, read and forgotten, surviving now only in library collections. Police circulars were printed by the hundreds for distribution, most of them eventually discarded or lost. Only their association with Dorothy Arnold, only their connection to the mystery of her disappearance, makes them significant, transforming them from ordinary objects into evidence, artifacts, clues. The museum display, if it exists, would be placed under glass, protected from touch, preserved for future researchers and curious visitors. The arrangement would imply questions without answering them. What happened to the woman who wore these gloves? Who bought this book? Whose face appears on this police circular? The text panel might present the competing theories, might note that the case was never solved, might observe that Dorothy Arnold's disappearance remains one of New York's most famous unsolved mysteries. But the display, for all its careful arrangement and scholarly apparatus, cannot answer the questions that matter most. It cannot tell us what Dorothy was thinking as she smoothed her gloves that December morning, what she hoped or feared, what she intended to do, what happened to her on Fifth Avenue or in Central Park, or wherever she went after Gladys King saw her for the last time. The objects are silent, the archive incomplete, the mystery permanent. We began with a woman in a townhouse mirror, smoothing the fingers of pale gloves over chilled hands before stepping out into a winter morning. We end with gloves under glass, no longer worn but preserved, no longer tools of daily life, but objects of historical interest. The gloves remain, carefully maintained in museum storage or private collections, while the woman who wore them exists now only in photographs, newspaper articles, police files, and the questions that can never be definitively answered. The space between presence and absence, between the living woman and the historical artifact, is marked by these objects and by the act of trying to interpret them. In that small, precise space where gloves once connected a body to the world and now connect us to a vanished life, the question persists: where did Dorothy Arnold go? And equally important, perhaps more important, what was she trying to escape? And did she succeed?